Assalamu alaikum, everybody. This is Brother Farid from Muslim Youth Revival. Today we have a presentation on we have an event for Black History Month, and then the topic is the Cotton Frontier. So we have a guest speaker this time, alhamdulillah, Brother Salman Saqar. So Salman Saqar has over 10 years of experience in running youth groups and working with the underprivileged. He is currently an instructor with the I3 Institute, and his academic area of research is social political thought. And he is also pursuing his MBA with a focus on the global impact of colonialism in Africa. MashaAllah. So we have, we're very blessed to have such a educated, knowledgeable speaker. So we hope you guys can benefit from this event and learn more about an important part of our history globally. So inshallah, without further ado, Brother Salman, you have the mic.
Okay, barakallahu fikum. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Barakallahu fikum to the event with Muslim Youth Revival. I think this is very important work and a very important topic. So overall, as you heard, my focus really is just looking at the global impact of colonialism, especially in Africa. And just going through this research, I found that there's a lot to unpack. So I really tried my best to condense it in a way where it's consumable and easily to understand, and sort of take the audience through a journey as to what, the colonialism, how it really impacted Africa as a whole, and looking at certain diverse groups, specifically with the cotton trade, right? And there's a caveat here. I know it's Black History Month, but this presentation is not a segue to sort of use this as armament against, a specific demographic of people, let alone to call maybe white people devils or to incite Black nationalism, right? I think as Muslimin, we always have to keep in mind that what bonds all of us is La ilaha illallah, right? So what we're looking at is how did the cotton frontier really develop, and looking at the idea of social political thought. And what do I mean by that? So if you look at the birth of China, some people can say that the origin starts from the opioid crisis. Some of the, you could say, violence that has manifested today can either be a result of enlightenment or reactionary measures. So with the opioid crisis, which devastated China, that's what really led them to say, okay, we need to establish an identity. Looking at the Mongols, how did the Mongols become the Mongols? Was it just snap of a thumb, or was it more so a reactionary measure of war and conquering a certain demographic, whereby they established that we need to form a unified front in order to conquer others? So this presentation is meant to lead people to understand what were the socio-political ideas which gave birth to white supremacy, and that things don't just happen within a vacuum, inshallah ta'ala. So where do we start? There's a school of thought, and I really start with a map when it comes to white supremacy. It really goes back to the time of the Greeks with Aristotle. It was a part of Aristotelian theory, whereby Aristotle himself said, and I quote, "It is clear that there are certain people who are free and certain people who are slaves by nature. It is both their advantage and just for them to be slaves." So from a Greek perspective, the inability to speak Greek was a pretense for someone to become a slave, okay? So the viewpoint of slavery as a whole has evolved over time. So starting in 342 BC, slaves could easily be traded, acquired, taken from far away if they were just non-Greek. And this was pretense for someone to be a slave. So it really comes down to what were some of the false narratives. And you'll see that I'll ask certain questions and draw certain parallels between, historical context and the life that we're living today. And one of the false narratives that you see today is Africa, otherwise known as the Dark Continent, was a place devoid of civilization or science. And this is false, and I'll show you why. You see, the supposedly Dark Continent had many empires. You had the Fatimids, the Fatimid Khilafah up in North Africa. You had the Empire of Ghana, which had, some of the Wolof tribes that include the Ashanti, Yoruba, the Songhai empires. You had complex agriculture. You had systems of governance and people who were very skilled in trades, right? So the understanding is that there was a civilization already occurring and thriving in the African continent. And it was a mixture of people, systems, skilled trades, etc., which was present in Africa as a whole. So if this is the case, how did we get to the colonialism front or the colonial front? And it really starts with the adoption of Aristotelian theory, right? And I don't want to go too academic here, but just to make it easy to consume, you had certain philosophers during the Enlightenment period, the John Mayers, the David Humes, the Immanuel Kants, who used Aristotelian theory in 1510, and they start to popularize some of these concepts in the 1700s in order to conquer Africa, right? So if you're going to be able to sort of set up let's just say an argument for why you should either conquer a civilization or why you should take over a civilization. Remember how I was talking in the beginning that things don't just happen overnight. There's a specific school of ideas and concepts that need to be developed prior to certain actions being taken. So this Aristotelian theory is what really gave birth to some of the Enlightenment period for some of these philosophers who then said, you know what, as per scientific, using science, they rationalized racism. And how did they do that? Well, the quote from David Hume, I think, speaks to this relatively well, where he says, I am apt to suspect that Negroes, and in general, all other species of men, to be naturally inferior to whites. So there was never any civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent in action or speculation. And, David Hume was around the 1700s. So 1742 was where he made this statement. So as you can see, these philosophers started to, create their own sort of objective morality to determine, okay, whites are a certain class, Negroes and brown may be a certain class, and hence, since they are naturally inferior, it only makes sense that we as a civilized people need to civilize, these quote unquote barbarians, right? And notice that the British Empire didn't just stop at Africa. You had the British India Company, right? And hence they were able to take a lot of the resources from, the subcontinent and gather spices, teas, etc., and also plant some of their stooges there, right? So as you can see, this really started to evolve more and more and more, where so much so that, these philosophers who are very well grounded in logic, would say statements such as, what Immanuel Kant said, where he said this fellow was quite black from head to toe. And this is a clear proof that he was said to be stupid. And in fact, this is something called the non sequitur, meaning it's a statement that's not followed by logic. So he was actually heavily criticized by the intellectual community for making this statement, because he said, okay, sure, he may have been black from head to toe. And this was actually reported of a black person who had come to make some deliveries for some newspapers, etc. And he made this statement about this said individual, right? And the result or the centrality of his stupidity was a result of his skin color, right? And that's not a clear proof. That's illogical, right? As intellectualism and skin color are not interrelated, right? So now we're coming down to the idea of British commerce, you see? And this is something called chattel slavery. And chattel slaves were individuals who were treated as complete property to be bought and sold, And hence this slavery was inherited. So to give a little bit of context, slavery did exist, even prior to Islam coming, right? So in the time of Jahiliyyah, slavery took many forms, both whether in the Arabian Peninsula, in Africa, and maybe other parts of the Caucasus and the Balkans. Slavery was, you could say, a normal system put in place in order to acquire people, but there was many ways for one to acquire a slave. It could either be through bonded labor as a result of a loan, and this is what you call an indentured slave. It could be as a result of prisoners of war, or it could be a result of chattel slavery, right? The only difference with chattel slavery is that your debt could never be repaid. So hence, if I was a slave, my son is a slave, his son will be a slave, and it will keep going upon generations. And that's why chattel slavery was actually used as the most common means for British commerce in order to continually perpetuate and to grow the slave market. So think of it from an economic perspective. And it'll make sense as to why this was an economic frontier as opposed to a scientific one. But we need to think about what are the implications. Imagine over 10 million people from the African continent were eventually taken as slaves and distributed all throughout the Americas and Europe. These people were ministers, they were metallurgists, many scholars, especially in the areas of Mali and Timbuktu. You had people who were skilled in trades, you had doctors, you had agriculturalists. So imagine what the impact on generations would be if you had just removed a population size of 10 million people over a span of 300 years, right? What would the devastation be? How would one recover, right? And as part of the research is trying to understand what that impact looks like today. And Africa as a continent, it's still suffering from a lot of ideological and economic impacts as a result of this, right? So hence comes, you could say, white gold. You know how we have black gold, which is, the birth of finding oil, where it gave birth to like some of the oil tycoons like the Rockefellers, right? So what was white gold? And it was actually called white gold. And this was cotton. So to really understand just how impactful and what the supply chain of white gold was, it was a cycle, right? You had slavery as part of your labor in order to be able to pick the cotton. So they naturally acquired slaves from the African continent, right? Who were the main pushers and wholesalers of human capital or human labor? The Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British. So as you can see, there was a European uprisal of industry, but North America, or what we call the United States, was still growing as a nation, okay? So the supply chain was you would get slaves from the African continent, you would ship them to different parts and different continents, let's say the North Americas and maybe the Caribbean. This human capital would then be used to pick maybe, tobacco, sugarcane production, and then cotton. That raw cotton was then sent back to Europe, where they had already experienced the Industrial Revolution and had a lot of manufacturing, which was able to take the raw cotton and build textiles. And then they would come up with, clothes, different sorts of materials, and the final product would be shipped to all different parts of the world. And hence, this was this endless cycle. So really, what I call it is, you see how you have Silicon Valley today, where you look at California and some of these places like San Francisco, back in the 60s, 70s, with the birth of Microsoft, you had these, startups from the IBMs to the Apples, and all of them have like their own story as to how they were built. You can put sort of a picture that the cotton frontier was also a violent startup. Okay. North America, or the United States, was still growing as a nation. Remember, they were ruled by the European colonists, right? Specifically the British and aspects of the French. So you have the American Revolution, which happened in 1812. And who were they at the time? They were ranked 18th in the global economy. They had no influence in international trade. A lot of the Europeans would trade in exports of tobacco and coffee as a means to make money. But then something, you can say, at least from the Southern perspective, to them, miraculous happened. They found the white gold. And this launched them to become a superpower. They were not then ranked within a span of almost 60 to 70 years, ranked 4th in the global economy. 59% of US exports was cotton. Great Britain used to produce, or used to receive, at least around 800 million pounds of cotton, whereby the United States was supplying over 77% of that. For France, it was 152 million pounds of cotton. The United States was supplying 90% of that. Russia, 152 million pounds of cotton, 92%. So now you can see that United States has now become an economic superpower. You know, most of the time you watch videos and movies on Kunta Kinte, etc., and it seems like, you know, this cotton frontier is more of like a visual one, where you have, you know, certain plantation owners who are very brutal to slaves. And yes, they were brutal, right? But having said that, this created a specific system and class of people who sold cotton, and it was heavily concentrated in a specific area. And those were the Southerners, right? So if you ever, you know, look back at documentaries with Abraham Lincoln, etc., you know, and maybe you even visit, you know, the South, like the Mississippis, etc., there was something called the Southern way of life. And they started to quickly formulate an elite, a planter's elite. So just to get an idea of some of the numbers, you know, in the South, 55% of the population in the South were slaves. 49% of Mississippi households had slaves and owned slaves. And just 9% of them controlled over 31,000 plantations, right? Sorry, there's 31,000 plantation owners, which made up 9% of the entire population of the South. So let's put that into perspective, okay? If you have tech companies today, and there's quite a few of them, right? Just imagine that Silicon Valley, you have maybe a few tech companies which have acquired so much money, like, you know, the Amazons, the Microsofts, the Googles, etc. And maybe you can say a handful, which own maybe about, who knows, anywhere from 60 to 70% of, you know, the wealth that's generated within the US. This paints a picture that what it meant to really own a slave was something that was normalized in society. It wasn't taboo for someone to say that they had a slave. No, the thing is, there were some slaves who were just used as, you know, your typical servants within the household. There were some slaves that were used for tobacco plantations. And then majority of the slaves, which the Southerners then purchased from either the Brits or the Portuguese, were pumped into plantations, right? And these plantations were devastating conditions. 14 to 16 hours, they would be picking cotton. And as you know, cotton is a very thin sort of fiber, which comes from a plant which is very thorny, right? So to be able to pick, you know, bales of cotton, it takes an extensive period of time. So much so that when the slaves would come back after, you know, 14 hours of straight picking, their hands would be bloodied, right? So then you think, okay, but then how do you sustain slaves to have that much energy? Well, they would use cheap sources of food, you know, salted fish. Notice how something called soul food, where you had the the bare minimum of food that most people within a white household would not touch, like chitlings, pork, intestines, etc. So you notice that a lot of the soul food that is sort of manifested today is as a result of the diets that the slaves naturally had to pick up in order to sustain themselves. So this planters elite was a very dominant elite. They're a very small, minute group of people, but they became politicians. They owned the newspapers. They were the ones who were able to acquire European credit. They were able to influence parliament. They were able to purchase mass amounts of military equipment. So they became the Silicon Valley of the US between the North and the South. And hence, they were able to dictate a lot of politics throughout the United States. And remember, it's not necessarily the United States as of yet, as you have, this sort of battle between the North and the South. But the planters elite were the people who were able to dictate policy, right? They were able to be like the Steve Jobs of that time. They were the people who were the Trumps who, built the Trump Tower and eventually became, presidents. These were the planters elite, and they were able to acquire such positions of power as a result of the industry that they were in. So let's have a parallel today. So this is the first parallel. If you look at the 9% of the planters elite, they controlled nearly 77% of the US economy at the time. Let's contrast that to today, where the 1% owns nearly 75% of today's wealth. So remember how I had mentioned that it's the idea of thought which really pushes people to embody ideals, systems, which then impact society at large. So the capitalism of then versus the capitalism of today is no different. So the next school of thought, which is really the Southern way of life, and this is where Christendom had a bit of its influence, right? And as you can see, this picture is blackface. So what did the Southerners believe? They were very religious, very conservative, but you know how the Muslims, we have our own concept of doing ijtihad in Islam, being able to take and looking at the Quran and the Sunnah, and then being able to take those aspects of the Quran and the Sunnah and coming up with, new ways to sort of implement, new situations and conditions to today, right? The only difference is Islam has a very structured approach as to how you're able to extract rulings from Islam, using the usul and the usul al-fiqh of certain madahib. And, it's a very structured approach, whereas from the Christian perspective, there was no sort of principles for fiqh where one can look at a verse and say, okay, what's the tafsir of this, verse from the Bible? It was up to anyone's interpretation. So how the Southerners interpret this verse in the King James Bible was, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. And this was another non sequitur whereby their conclusion was that, okay, khalas, this is referring to your typical slaves today. Who are the earthly masters? Well, of course, that's us, right? And hence you have to, obey us with respect and fear and sincerity of heart, just as you will obey who? Christ, or supposedly God. So to make it a little bit more relevant, because I know we're in the Canadian context of things, and I'll be sort of speeding through some of this. I won't go into too much detail, but there are also key Canadian figures, and I don't want people to be sort of lost whereby it was only an American problem. This is a North American problem, and a lot of the founders in some, considering some of our sort of prestigious banking institutions and universities, were very anti-abolition, right? And you have Enos Collins, who is actually the founder of CIBC. He was a slave ship owner, right? William Lawson, who was also the founder of Scotiabank, dealt in the business of selling transatlantic ships so that they could acquire chattel slaves from the African continent. You know, I have Joshua Mager, who was a slave importer. And if you look at, I think, Halifax or Nova Scotia, he has a city named after him. James McGill, famously known as McGill University, he was a slave owner. Lieutenant Michael Salaberry, who has a street named after him in Quebec, was able to quell slave rebellion. So remember, we said the European colonialists who were prior to America, they were eventually booted out through the American Revolution, but a lot of them stayed in Canada, the Quebec area, etc., and they built their lives there. You know, they established businesses, and a lot of these businesses dealt with, you know, shipping out slaves to the Caribbeans or providing the ships of harboring slaves. So it's not just slaves within itself, but understand that there was an economy that was brewing, which is moving of human beings from one place to another required extensive amount of resources, funding, hence money, ships to harbor slaves, obviously the slaves themselves, of course, the manufacturing of those ships, the building of those manufacturing plants of those transatlantic ships, the food source for slaves. And when I say food source, like if you were to put food in terms of grades, like maybe you have grade A meat, let's say grade B meat, grade F meat, etc. There were certain types of food which was high quality food, which was sent to the Europeans, and anything that couldn't meet the standard of quality was slave food. And hence that was an economy and a way of making money within itself. So the abolition, is it an economic exercise or not? Meaning, did Abraham Lincoln abolish slavery on the basis of humanitarian principle? And that's something that we're really led to believe. And this is a false narrative. This is a false narrative. And why is that the case? It's because if you look at the dynamic between the North and the South were becoming very strong. You know, they owned a lot of property. They had a lot of economic ties to Europe. You know, imagine you being a white Southerner who wants to make an honest living. And you're looking at the Silicon Valley of the South, and all of these people are getting into the business of cotton naturally as a way to provide for your family. Although they may not have been racist within itself, you might say, look, Yani, if I want to, you know, become rich like this, if I want to pursue the so-called American dream, or if I want to be someone seen as a politician or own my own newspaper company, that's what I need to be doing, regardless if I disagree with the practice or not. I don't necessarily sympathize with people from the South, but at the end of the day, I can at least respect the level of prosperity that they've been able to build. And hence, it was just natural that people gravitated towards being a Southerner because they wanted to be prestigious. Whereas people from the North, they didn't really have much industry. They didn't see that cotton was sustainable because it required to torture slaves. And as you can see this picture of the back of a slave, you know, to keep them in line and to continuously rebel. You know, the politicians, and Abraham Lincoln was at least forward thinking, where he said, you know what, look, he had slaves, by the way, but again, this was just common practice. But he says, look, using human capital to propel the cotton industry is not sustainable. Yani, if we're looking at the European Revolution and the Industrial Revolution in Europe, we need to come up with our own sort of manufacturing. We need to come up with something innovative. Cotton is not sustainable and it needs to be regulated. The South had become too powerful. And what did this lead to? The Civil War, where the Northerners were now attacking the way of life of the Southerners. And this is where you could say that it was a downward spiral, right? There's a lot of whites from the North that did not agree with the practices of the whites from the South and said, look, you guys are becoming too powerful. We need to be able to consolidate power. So hence, what did the Southerners do? In desperation, they said, look, they went to Great Britain and said, hey, listen, we're the main producers of cotton. If you don't help us militarily, that's it. Your supply is cut. We will no longer supply you any cotton. But you see, the British they were watching the political situation very, very closely. Now, whether they had agents on the ground, Allahu A'lam, but they were watching the situation so closely that they sort of predicted that, you know what, we are so heavily reliant on US cotton, we need to start building a reserve. So they built a reserve over the span of 5 to 10 years of 1 million pounds of cotton. So eventually what happened? There was a civil war. So the South made a proposal that if you do not militarily help us, they said no cotton. Great Britain said, sayonara, no thanks. We don't want to get into a war. It's bad for business. So essentially the South had no military support. So they tried to put in a conscription act, which would force men of the ages between 18 and 35 to go to war, to go to battle for some of, you could say, the Southerners. But the only problem was that if you had owned 20 or more slaves, if you were wealthy enough, you didn't have to go to war, meaning you didn't have to join the army. So naturally, what does that mean? It means people who cannot afford it would have to fight. And then this caused a lot of tension amongst the elite Southerners versus the people who were not so elite. And hence, you know, there was a lot of people saying, as you can see by the photo, you're crazy. What? Because I'm poor, I got to go to war for you? You've acquired so much wealth. Like, how is that fair? How is that fair? You know, I don't have 20 slaves. Maybe I have 5. I'm not making millions of dollars of a year, but why do I have to, me and my, 5 to 10 sons have to go to war for the rich? And this caused a lot of tension. So hence they fought. The South lost, and they unfortunately suffered a massive defeat in Mississippi. Almost 620,000 people killed, nearly 500,000 were wounded, and hence you could say that the defeat was inevitable. And this is sort of the second parallel I want to draw everyone towards from an Islamic perspective, is that you see the planters elite, they fought to uphold slavery as a way of life. It was an institutional pillar. Whereas the Quraysh fought Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to uphold their jahiliyyah, right? So as you notice, like and I'll probably go into that a little bit later, but as you can see, in a time of ignorance, the Arabs were very you can say forceful or aggressive against the Islamic stance, is because it had implications. La ilaha illallah had extensive implications for the Quraysh at the time, in terms of redefining them as a tribe, redefining the concepts of brotherhood, redefining how is wealth distributed, how is wealth acquired, redefining the concept of marriage, and so many different things. Instead of man being the ilah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ilah. Okay? So now where do we come to full-on white supremacy? You see, as it has evolved to today, whereas when the Southerners were defeated, this was where they gave birth to the White League. And a lot of the people who had European sentiments eventually formed something called the White League, which then evolved into what we are now known as you can see by the picture, the KKK, right? So first it started as the White League. They were defeated. People said, look, they want to go back to the honor that they had as slave owners. They were people who were able to dictate policy. There were people who were influencers. There were people who owned those newspapers. There were people who had access to European credit. Well, not anymore. The North, the Republican North did a good job of breaking that up. And hence there was these fringe groups that were very secret that still held a lot of the aspects of hereditariness in terms of the Aryan race, right? And they started to target a lot of white Republicans who were sympathizers to the abolitionists and blacks. So here, coming to a wrap, I know I've sort of sped through a lot of things, but I really wanted to paint a picture for everyone as to how did the cotton frontier really impact the world as we see today, and what is the Islamic solution for all of mankind, right? And that if we look at the views on origin, the philosophical thinking of white supremacists is very different from the Islamic perspective. How Islam and Muslims define objective morality is very different from how the enlightened philosophers define objective morality. Remember, they were in Europe. This is where there was separation between church and state. They did not believe that God had the right to dictate human affairs when it came to the political realm, scientific realm, etc. And that's just as a result of having a lot of negative stigma to how the church really ruled people. It was very oppressive, and it stunted growth and innovation. So from the Islamic perspective, the Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he came, he received the wahi, wherein Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, says to Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, so to that religion of Allah invite, O Muhammad, and remain on the right course as you are commanded. And do not follow their inclinations, but say, I have believed in what Allah has revealed of the Quran, and I have been commanded to do justice among you. And where does justice come from other than Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala? Right? And this is where it comes down to the problem. Is, you see, ideas are, what started as a premise for differentiating between Greek and non-Greek eventually evolved to the Negro being inferior, eventually evolved into slavery as being God-given, which eventually evolved into white supremacy and white Europeans as being the superior race. You see, ideas are very powerful, and violence doesn't just start out of nowhere, but it's ideas that truly prep society, right? And Islam, you see, if we look at the box today, in today's, you could say, environment, the source of thought is the so if we're looking at the source of thought, good and bad governance or systemic oppression and public dissent, what are the tools for the white supremacists? And I'd say that, look, things have changed as a result of public pressure. So first you have Confederacy laws, chattel slavery, and eventually that grows. There was a lot of pressure from the blacks. You had Jim Crow, housing, segregation, a lot of issues with public school system, and then, more of a push from the public, but then you have state-sponsored prejudice, rich tax breaks, etc. And I'm saying that box has never really changed, right? That the tools and the systems put in place to really rule and guide people is not from an objective source, which is mankind. See, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala says, أَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ أَفَأَنْتَ تَكُونُ عَلَيْهِ وَكِيلًا. Have you seen the one who takes his desires as his own ilah? This is, this person is equivocated to as being cattle. Why? Is because, if your sense of thought is what guides you and your desires is what guides you, how can one ever come to the truth? You're basically acting on animal instinct, and your desires have now become the ilah, whereas Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala wasn't the ilah, right? Whereas at the time of the Arabs, when the Rasul said that La ilaha illallah, this was a statement that was powerful, because they immediately understood that they used to be the Rabbs of society, whereas they believed in Allah, but they did not believe Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala to be the ilah, the one true guide, the one true source of reference for all of mankind's affairs. And hence, I will wrap up with that, is that if we look at these different tools for systemic oppression, okay, you have atheism and Scientology as being some of the basis for understanding. Well, you want to put Christendom, fine. Morality is very subjective, and it's very difficult today to say, okay, who's right, who's wrong from a very objective moral stance. Capitalism, at that time and this time, the framework has maybe evolved, but it hasn't changed much, right? You still have a law. Barakallahu feek. Yeah, so just quickly, I was talking about, how the Rabbs of Mecca, they didn't see, they saw themselves as the ilah, but Islam came to really reform, race politics, in terms of the economic system? How do you define brotherhood with nationalism, or is it some other means in terms of idea and belief? That morality is not subjective, yani it's objective. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that dictates what's right and wrong. And hence the Islamic system for systemic justice really relies on answering the basic questions on what's the origin of man, where does objective morality come from, God's laws, what the unity of belief, and that the deed is a metric system for determining who's better than the other person. Is not based upon race. The famous message that the Rasul ﷺ gave on his last pilgrimage, where an Arab is not superior to a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab is superior to an Arab. A white is not superior to a black, nor is a black superior to a white. And hence, Islam really laid out the groundwork for determining wealth distribution and true justice. And I guess the conclusion that I'm making is that Islam is the only solution for how we unite people, and that uniting people on the basis of white nationalism, black nationalism, brown nationalism is not the solution. Uniting people on the basis of economic class is not the solution. Islam is holistic and comprehensive, and there is no doubt about that. And hence, if we, are building sort of this narrative that we used to discuss with our BLM folk and people who may have different sort of social political views, I would say that understanding the sort of evolution of thought and how the society is today, which is important, but also painting the picture that Islam not only has systemic justice sort of built within it, but it has a solution for how mankind deals with each other, and how it defines right and wrong, and how it establishes relationships. So with that, I will end. Subhanak wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Barakallahu feekum.